My name's Sam Niedra. I work for the Albury Conservation Company. We're a local community group that's advocating for biodiversity protection in this area. And Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve is a pretty special place in terms of biodiversity locally. It's like the jewel in the crown for biodiversity. There's lots of amazing features about this. It's about 85 hectares in total, this plot of land. And it contains really significant biodiversity values like hollow-bearing trees. These are incredibly important for local species like squirrel gliders and many other species. A hollow-bearing tree is, in this case, a really old eucalypt. Hollows form naturally in old trees, and it usually takes about 100 years before hollows form. And it's usually when a branch falls off the tree. And in some cases, some of the trees here are even older than that. Really big hollows usually only form in trees that are 200 plus years old. So there's a number of eucalypt species in Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve. One of the main ones that you see around here is Eucalyptus blakeleyi, which is Blakely's red gum or hill red gum. And there's a few others like yellow box, white box, even red box. There'd be apple box as well. These big old trees with hollows are critically important for the conservation of local threatened species. Squirrel gliders are a classic example. Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve is like the jewel in the crown for biodiversity, and we've done some mapping of hollow-bearing trees here. And this site contains the highest density of hollow-bearing trees of anywhere in Thurgoona. So yeah, it's a very important spot for hollows. So the Albury Conservation Company was formed in 2006, so we've been around for a decade now. It was actually formed in response to the duplication of the freeway in Albury. When it was built, it cuts through some significant habitat, not too dissimilar to the habitat we find in Bell's TSR, so box gum woodland. And it was really important habitat for a number of species that also use Bell's TSR, like the squirrel glider that I mentioned before. As part of the offset for the removal of vegetation, the New South Wales Road Traffic Authority, which is now the Roads and Maritime Services, gifted the local community $500,000 to, initially it was to be spent on glider poles so that squirrel gliders could make their way across the freeway. And you see these poles along the freeway, for example in Womargama, Tarcutta, and even in Victoria down towards Euroa. And I wasn't around at the time, but what happened is the community got together, formed a committee that eventually became the Albury Conservation Company. And that group decided that that money could be better spent. Even though glider poles have been proven to be effective in certain situations, they thought that they could get greater value out of that $500,000 by investing in research, on-ground works and community education and engagement. And so the Albury Conservation Company was formed through that process. And here we are 10 years later, it's still here, and I'll talk about some of the achievements, but yeah, that was the history of how it was established. So the Albury Conservation Company is essentially a board of a mixture of local residents and also representatives of key organisations in Thurgoona. For example, David Sexton is a local resident. He's the chair. He's been a long time chair of the Albury Conservation Company. Also Rob Fenton sits on the board. He's the vice chair. Nigel Jones from the Nature Conservation Trust. Damien Michael has recently come on board from the Australian National University. Catherine Allen, who's a staff member at Charles Sturt Uni, but also a resident at Tabletop. And the key pillars, as I mentioned before, that are the focus of Albury Conservation Company are biodiversity research, on-ground works, and community engagement and capacity building and education. So we're very much informed by some very significant documents, planning documents that are relevant to this area. And one of the key documents is the Thurgoona Threatened Species Conservation Strategy, which was written in 2004 by Ian Davidson and others. It really analysed this landscape in terms of its biodiversity values and set targets and objectives that inform some of the decision making that we follow. But also too, that document laid the framework for the establishment of the Albury Environmental Land Network. Albury Environmental Land Network is a network of land that's been set aside for conservation. And in this area, probably 20% of the area is set aside under the Albury Environmental Land Network. And so Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve is essentially part of that network of protected environmental land. And so one of the key drivers behind Albury Conservation Company is to acknowledge that we've got that network in place, but also to understand it a little bit more, and then also in context with the development that's happening around that network, trying to raise awareness about the values, the environmental values in the region. So in terms of some of the biodiversity research that Albury Conservation Company is doing, a project at the moment is we're currently mapping hollow-bearing trees in Thurgoona Willinga. I mentioned before how significant hollow-bearing trees are. One in four native Australian species, or vertebrate species, so species with a backbone, so you think mammals, bats are mammals, birds, reptiles, even frogs. Well, frogs don't have backbones, but 1 in 4 species with backbones, vertebrate species, use hollows for survival. So they use hollows for habitat, to nest, to raise young. If they don't have hollows, they don't exist. And so what we've been doing, we've been mapping, over the past 18 months, we've been mapping hollow-bearing trees around Thurgoona, and we've done a section of Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve, and we've found that on average there's about 3 hollow-bearing trees per hectare in Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve. In other areas, some of the creek lines that are part of Albury Environmental Lands, like Woolshed Creek and 8 Mile Creek, they have about 2 hollow-bearing trees per hectare. And I think it sort of slips away after that. So obviously if you go into some of the open paddocks, the numbers drop away. So really in terms of hollows, the reserves like Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve are really significant in terms of providing that resource for threatened species. We've mapped about 550 trees so far around Thurgoona, and we're just doing that by it's a ground-based survey using binoculars, measuring the circumference of the tree using tape, walking around the tree and counting the amount of hollows that we can see just by, through binoculars, recording the tree species and also whether it's alive or dead. And we're finding about 20% of the trees with hollows in this area are actually dead. And that raises the value of dead trees in terms of a critical resource for hollow-dependent species. So that's one project. Another project we've invested in, we funded a PhD project out of Charles Sturt Uni that was being undertaken by Alexandra Knight on Sloane's froglet. Sloane's froglet is a tiny little frog that only occurs in 2 places in the world, and they just happen to be Thurgoona and Corowa. There might be others, don't quote me on that, but I think at the time of Alex's PhD it really drove home the significance of this species and how little, how small the population was and how restricted its range was. And since then, since Alex's research, they've found more sites around Thurgoona that the frog occurs in, and one of the key findings is one of the key habitats for the frog is these nondescript little depressions in the landscape where water sits at various times of the year, and that's been found as being perfect habitat for this little frog, which raises interesting questions, interesting challenges in terms of conserving the species. Because I think traditionally you think of conserving species in patches of bushland like this, whereas for Sloane's froglet, some of its key habitat is actually out in the paddocks that are now zoned for residential. And the species wasn't picked up at the time when the Albury Local Environmental Plan was put into place in 2010. So the discovery of that species and the significance of that species has thrown up a couple of challenges in terms of, okay, how do we continue on in this fashion? Because development is earmarked, you know, this area is the growth corridor for Albury. But how do we add some flexibility in there so that we can ensure that this species survives into the future? And that's what it should be. It shouldn't be a really rigid plan. And something on paper is just that. It's something on paper. It needs to be a little bit flexible because the environment is flexible. It doesn't, conform to strict rules. So when you talk about hollow-bearing trees, there's been a lot of research around habitat like this, so boxgum woodland, and it's estimated that between 7 and 17 hollow-bearing trees per hectare is the benchmark for really high-quality boxgum woodland. So given that Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve only has about 3 hollow-bearing trees per hectare, even though it's the jewel in the crown in this landscape, it still doesn't meet the sort of high-quality benchmark that occurs in other areas. We're starting from a lower base, which is really significant when you start talking about how do we conserve local species like the squirrel glider that depend on hollows. Residential development in and around Thurgoona, around the Albury Environmental Land Network, and around sites like Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve presents some real challenges in terms of conserving threatened species. Obviously at the moment these sites are surrounded by a rural agricultural landscape, and it's been like this for a significant amount of time. And over the next 20 or 30 years, with the development of Thurgoona as the growth corridor of Albury, there's a Thurgoona-Willinga structure plan in place. So there's land earmarked for development. As that starts to unfold, well, it's already started to unfold, but as that picks up and development occurs, for example, south of Bell's TSR and also to the north, the interplay between the development land and the conservation areas like Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve will change dramatically. So it'll go from a rural setting to a highly urbanised setting with a conservation interface. And we talked before about rules and boundaries, and nature's not necessarily responsive to imposed boundaries and rules, and it's greatly affected by the things that are happening in the surrounding landscape. There's a concept called edge effect to sites like this. So, things that are happening just outside can impact on the reserve, and it's usually, depending on the size and the shape and the dimensions of the conservation area, the edge effect is such that pressures from outside the reserve will impact, in some cases, just on the immediate edge if it's a really big reserve. But if it's a small reserve like Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve, which is only 85 hectares, probably 1 kilometre at the most in either direction, the likelihood that the effect of the residential developments will pretty much cover the whole of the Bells TSR reserve. So we have to be really careful about things like the introduction of cats. So a new development, let's say there's 200 houses, so half the houses might have cats. And if those cats aren't contained during the day and especially at night, there's nothing really stopping those cats from then venturing into Bells TSR and then impacting on wildlife, like the Sloane's froglet, which, if it's in little puddles, a bite-sized treat, I'd imagine, for a cat wandering through. But even things like squirrel gliders, cats are an issue because they can climb trees, they can access hollows that gliders might be sheltering in, raising young, and also small birds, woodland birds. The best way to scare away birds from your garden is to have a cat. So you can imagine a number of cats wandering into an area like this. Some of the species that you see in this habitat living very comfortably might just start to drop away, and we all know, we've all got our own personal stories, but we know of particularly older people that say, oh yeah, 20 years ago I used to see that species, haven't seen one for 20 years. So we think we can merge the two. We're not opposed to development. People need to live somewhere, and this is a great place to live, but it's these nuances between, having a plan in place and actually executing the plan and not stuffing up the biodiversity in the process. Which, let's face it, a lot of people who move to Thurgoona move here because they like the rural setting, they like the bush, so it's got a heap to offer in that respect. In terms of dealing with the issue of cats and their potential impact on biodiversity, there are some options about. One option, and probably the most extreme option, is having cat-restricted residential developments. And this is happening in Canberra at the moment. I think last count, they're up to about 11 suburbs where cats are restricted. And this is not to say that residents can't have cats. They can have cats, but there's restrictions around cat movements and cat containment. So for example, cats have to be contained within the home or within a cat enclosure area. So we've all seen those sort of caged cat enclosures. And that's communicated to the community from the outset so that people don't move to the suburb, buy a house and move to a suburb and find out later that their cat can't roam free of a night time. So that's an option for Thurgoona. That's sort of in the hands of Albury City Council to take the initiative on something like that. There's precedence for it. In terms of other research around cats, there's an amazing research project being run by the University of South Australia at the moment. It was a program that was taken from the US, and it's been running for about 18 months. And it's a cat owner awareness program. What that program involves is putting a GPS collar on domestic cats and tracking their movements during the day and over a period of time. And one of the really interesting things that has come out of that program is just the changing perceptions of cat owners about the movements of their cats. Because I think if you asked most cat owners, they would probably tell you that their cat doesn't really roam that far. They might, go to the neighbours or across the street, and that's about it. But some of these participants in this project have been finding that their cat has been going way beyond where they had imagined. Like, for example, crossing, major roads to visit, a tip or an industrial area. And that raises some real issues in terms of cat safety, let alone what impacts the cat might be having on biodiversity, there's a real threat to the safety of the cat if it's crossing the freeway at every second night. The Slopes to Summit project is a conservation partnership project, and it involves 9 different organisations, all striving towards protecting and improving biodiversity in the region. And what the main aim of Slopes to Summit is to protect prime habitat, but also to improve connectivity of that habitat through the landscape, so that we're putting ourselves in the best position with things like climate change and all the unknowns associated with that, putting that sort of green infrastructure in place so that threatened species in the local region will have the best chance of surviving into the long term. So the organisations involved in that include Holbrook Landcare Network, who are the facilitator host, Charles Sturt University, Australian National University, Murray Local Land Services, Nature Conservation Trust of New South Wales, CSIRO, Parklands Albury Wodonga, and Albury Conservation Company. One of the things the Slopes to Summit Partnership does is get together and put in co-funding bids. And about 5 years ago, we were successful in securing about $2.3 million through the federal government to roll out a major biodiversity project in the region. And that's coming to a close soon. It's been managed by Holbrook Landcare Network on behalf of the partnership. But that's just had an amazing impact in terms of on-farm biodiversity protection in the region. Over 1,000 hectares of revegetation and large areas that have been large areas like Bell's Travelling Stock Reserve on private land that's been protected in many cases in perpetuity. So yeah, that's the kind of scale of project that Slopes to Summit is tackling. So as part of the Albury Conservation Company, one of the projects that we help to fund and we're involved in is the revegetation or the regreening of Little Budgeonidgee at Tabletop. Little Budgeonidgee is a hill on the property of Joe Esler, and Joe applied for some funding through our community grants program, which we ran in 2012. He applied for some funding to regreen the hill, which had been bare. It had been in his family for at least a couple of generations, and had been bare all his life, bar a couple of lone hill red gums and other vegetation. But it was unfenced. It had rabbit issues, weed issues. It was grazed by stock, and Joe was inspired to do something about it and put some vegetation back into the site. Little Budgeonidgee obviously is the offspring of Big Budgeonidgee. When I say offspring, it's metaphoric. But Big Budgeonidgee gave us a really good example. I think when you go to revegetate or try to restore an area, the first thing you do is you look around you and you see what it should look like. Get some clues of how, what species to put in, the kind of approach that you might take. Some of the issues that you really need to tackle before you plant a tree or whatever. So one thing we found with Joe is once he put up the fence and restricted stock and did a bit of rabbit control, what we were finding is it wasn't just all weeds. There were a lot of native grasses like spear grasses and wallaby grasses, too many to identify and list. And even little flowers, you know, really, at the site's really rocky, but half of it's just virtually granite. But even on the granite and within the little cracks and depressions, little things are emerging just by having, you know, the grazing pressure taken off. And so we weren't dealing with a site. We realised that we weren't dealing with a blank canvas at all. We're actually dealing with a site that was 50% there already, that was probably missing just some of the overstory, you know, the trees and some of the shrubs. So the focus of the revegetation, it was a staged approach. I think revegetation, if you treat it as just a one-off, you know, we'll go in, we'll revegetate, then we'll leave, and we won't do any more revegetation. You can miss opportunities and you don't get to improve on the technique that you might have thought was the right way to go. Initially we did a machine direct seeding, and we found that wasn't hugely successful. Timing might have had something to do with that, but one of the observations of the machine direct seeding is where there were areas of where there were depressions in the soil left by the machine, that was often the spot where the best results occurred. So you'd often have these little depressions and you'd have this little mini forest of acacias and eucalypts and whatever else growing in these depressions. So later on we revisited that site, we purchased more seed, and then we went in and did hand seeding. So a lot more, we took a much more targeted approach, and we got the students from National Environment Centre and Sue Brunskill to come out, and we did the old-fashioned, you know, chipping away with a hoe and a shovel, making little patches suitable for seeding, and that's where we seeded, and the results have been fantastic. Just using different techniques and being open to experimenting a little bit, and Joe's been awesome. He's been right along for the journey, so to speak, and really involved, and I think even last winter he was planting eucalypts in patches where there was a deficiency in trees. So it's still early days, it's only a few years old, and obviously to revegetate, to regreen a site is a long process, but we've definitely turned the site from a denuded rocky hill to something that's a little bit more living and conducive to growing habitat. So with hollow bearing trees, obviously they're the preferred habitat for squirrel gliders, but given that they take 100 to 200 years to form, it's not something you can just click your fingers. If there aren't hollow bearing trees in an area, you can't just click your fingers and instantly they appear. So one thing that's been happening over the last, well, it's been happening for probably over 10 years in this area, is the construction and installation of nest boxes. Nest boxes can be designed to purpose, you know, for purpose to suit particular species, and squirrel gliders are no different. So you can build boxes that squirrel gliders absolutely love. One of the downsides, if there are any, about hollow bearing trees is all the hollows are all different shapes and sizes, and they suit different species. So you might look at one tree and it might have 10 hollows, but by chance none of them suit squirrel gliders. But with a nest box, if you design it correctly, it can be perfect for squirrel gliders. Something that a tree might take 200 years to build, the guys down at Thurgoona Men's Shed could whack one up in probably half an hour. So yeah, probably over the last 10 years there've been a heap of nest boxes put in this landscape. Initially it was really ad hoc, you know, let's just find a tree and put them up. Albury Conservation Company initiated it, but there's also been other groups like Parklands, Albury Wodonga, the Woolshed Thurgoona Landcare Group, Albury Environmental Land Network, which is managed by the New South Wales Department of Industry. A number of groups have started to map the hollows that are already out in the landscape, and we've mapped about 600 to date. Not only have the ones that are already out there been mapped, but more boxes are being built, but we're starting to look at the data. We're starting to look at the distribution of hollow-bearing trees matched with the distribution of nest boxes and saying, okay, well, where are the gaps that would benefit most from putting up more nest boxes? The other thing we look at too is the distribution of squirrel gliders. So matching that information and saying, well, if we're going to build a nest box and put it somewhere, here's the spot that we should be doing it. Okay, so the squirrel glider occurs along Eastern Australia from Queensland down to Victoria. In New South Wales, it's listed as a threatened species. It's classed as being vulnerable. In Victoria, it's classed as being endangered. In Queensland, it's not sure of the conservation status in Queensland. The numbers are a bit safer up there. But essentially, it occupies this band along Eastern Australia that originally contains habitat like this, boxgum woodland. And sadly, over 95% of this habitat has been cleared for agriculture, but also, residential development, and which is particularly relevant to this landscape. So the species range probably hasn't reduced, but in terms of available habitat, it's been absolutely hammered. So remnant boxgum woodland like Bell's TSR are obviously critical in terms of squirrel glider conservation, but also too, it's the bits along roadsides, along creeks, even in some cases paddock trees that help join up the landscape, keeping in mind that squirrel gliders can safely glide about 40 metres. Anything beyond that, it becomes an issue because if they can't glide safely from tree to tree, they either stay restricted, so that's obviously having an impact on being able to find mates, which impacts on reproduction. But if it attempts to, cross an area that's greater than 40 metres, there's a risk of it going to ground. And we've all seen photos of gliders strung up on barbed wire fences. That occurs, but also too, they're more at risk of being predated by foxes and cats. So having remnants like this, but also connectivity that sort of links patches like this together is critical. Why are squirrel gliders important? Every species is important, has its own unique right to exist. It's a cool animal. It's one of, I think, 7 gliders in Australia, glider species. It's a mammal, it's a marsupial. Its diet is varied, so it eats a lot of insects. I guess in terms of that role, it's helping to reduce predation on things like eucalypts. So it is part of that insect pest control group that services trees. If you take out those species, that can impact significantly on tree health, and you see that in paddock trees, for example.